Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Andrea Hines. I am a woman in Canada who speaks and writes about the commercial sex industry after spending 7 years in Edmonton's licensed and regulated prostitution system. And I'm here today with Ellie.
Hi, I'm Ellie Arrow. I'm in Germany, a country infamous for its legal prostitution industry, a country that's having a huge debate about whether that's something we want to continue, whether it's really making women safer. Yeah, I'm not a survivor of the industry myself, but I've spent the last 8 years looking into it, speaking to women who've lived it, and I'll be sharing about our collective cultural experience here in this episode.
So we sat down and said, what's a really important topic that we need to talk about before many other things possibly, and just really set the groundwork for future episodes. And I think pretty quickly, Ellie and I both agreed it was the safety myth. And so there is a fallacy in legal and decriminalized prostitution regimes that they are automatically safer for the women, that they are safer for the sex consumers, that they are safer for communities, and that it's just the harm reduction approach that should ever be taken and ran with, and that any form of criminalization is dangerous and decreases safety. That's probably the most pressing argument I think that I'm seeing and have been seeing in now the 11 years that I've been doing activism. I don't know about you, Ellie, but it's everywhere online for sure.
Yeah, it's very popular. It's sometimes even, well, if only the laws and the culture were right, this could be as safe as, let's say, waitressing, right? A little bit of risk of harassment, maybe not the most prestigious job, but, you can get by and then move on to better, bigger things. And you could put it down in your resume and, you wouldn't carry any significant scars from that time, that there's nothing inherent about this industry that harms or poses danger. And while we try to transition to that, we will do harm reduction.
Listeners, as you can imagine, this is a very weighty topic. We could probably talk for hours on this, but we'll try not to take all your time of your day. But there's a lot of things that we do want to touch on. And I think the first thing is this larger idea or concept of safety. And then once we kind of pick and choose some things to talk about specific to that, then we really want to get into the actual concrete measures that are being employed. So things like camera systems, panic buttons, again, licensing systems in municipalities in different countries, and really stop and examine, is this actually helping the situation, or is this just, harm continuation rather than actual efforts towards harm elimination? Maybe I'll pass it over to you, Ellie, starting with this idea that women will just by large be safer with men physically, emotionally, if they are in a system that supports the idea of sex work.
Right. So everything that I'll be going over here is really based on countries like Germany or Switzerland or the Netherlands or New Zealand. Spend a lot of time studying the kind of safety advice that women get. I think to start off, we have to actually not talk about prostitution specifically, but talk about sex. And the fact that it's become, at least I think among a lot of leftists and feminists, which we also consider ourselves, it's become unpopular to admit that sex is vulnerable, especially for women, physically and emotionally vulnerable. It's just a fact that if you are any woman alone in a room with the average guy, you are physically weaker than him. You're especially vulnerable if you're naked, if he's on top of you, if he's inside you. None of this is saying that all sex is bad, all sex is violent, that, it can't be a lovely consensual thing. But if you can acknowledge that there is a risk, even outside of prostitution, to getting intimate as a woman, now, if you introduce the context of payment into it, where, the average woman in prostitution That guy is a virtual stranger to her. His expectation that sex will be done according to his specifications is really, really high. People imagine it's like doing maybe, a Tinder date a week. That's the level of risk a woman in sex trade's taking. It's actually, on average, something like half a dozen guys per day to make ends meet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we really struggle to acknowledge that is inherently risky without pointing the finger and saying, well, she just shouldn't do it. We'd fix it if women just didn't do prostitution, they didn't get assaulted, without considering, for the average woman, it's paying her bills, keeping the lights on. In Germany, supporting her family back in Romania, Bulgaria. She can't snap her fingers and leave that. And we'll do whole episodes on why it's, why women get into prostitution, why it's hard to get out. But that's really the first point. Sex is dangerous for all women. And then the reality of the average prostitution situation ups that danger significantly.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that unfortunately we can't mention biological differences between men and women, and we can't mention the impact that things like pornography have had on the conditioning of men, of their mindset. And we can't talk about the, on average, I think, higher sex drive that many men have in comparison to women, at least at certain times of their reproductive cycles and things like that, right? So if you say any of those things, oh, you're a misandrist and you hate men, and you're infantilizing women, you're making them sound weak and vulnerable. But we do have to look at, like you said, those differences that a lot of men are sometimes even upwards of twice our weight and a foot taller than us. They do have these biological differences that we can't deny them. They are real. And so if you say sex is vulnerable for women, then people unfortunately take that as saying men are sexual predators. And that's not what we're saying. That's, I don't think, what anyone is saying. They're just saying you are physically at risk to, like you said, be under somebody who is larger than you. And if they want to go the route of mistreating you, there's really nothing that will stop them. So when you can look at that in a social context on a macro level, when you then hone into the micro level of prostitution, you can see how that would be worsened, because now there's that introduction of payment and there is that entitlement. There's the expectations of what she will do or what she should, quote, have to do, because, customer is king. The buyer is always right. That kind of attitude where when we're applying these typical labor situations or labor analysis to something that is ultimately coerced sex, it undoubtedly changes that dynamic. But yeah, I appreciate you starting with that note, because I think for people to understand the amplified danger that women in prostitution face, they must first understand that there is vulnerability for women, just sexual encounters in everyday life when we're living in a patriarchal society. Absolutely. I don't know the numbers in Germany. You might know something a bit more, but I know here in Canada, we haven't really had any reliable studies on the amount of sex buyers that exist. So it's hard to even talk about the volume of what we're discussing here in relative terms, because we just don't really have much to go off of. There's been some research done. There's been several small studies, but a lot of them are, small sample sizes or questionable methodologies, stuff like that. So we never really will truly know how many sex buyers we're talking about. But for Canada, if we're looking at the North American estimate that's been floated around for quite some time, around 15% of North American people being sex buyers, mostly men. If we're looking in Canada and we're taking the portion of the population that is 18 to 75, that equates at 15% of our population to approximately 2 million sex buyers in Canada. You can get into these ideas of like Russian roulette, right? Okay, not every sex buyer is going to choke you, is going to do all these horrible things to you, but it's just like opening up a bag of Skittles. If one of those lone Skittles is poisonous, how many are you going to eat with confidence, feeling safe and not causing you any kind of fear or visceral reaction or any of those like reactions of the body? At what point are you going to interact one of those toxic Skittles that really does grave harm to you? So yeah, I don't know what it's like in Germany, but that's an alarming number here in Canada to think about that many commercial sex exchanges happening if we have 2 million men buying sex in our country here.
So we have the same problem over here, anything related to the prostitution industry, trying to put any kind of numbers on it. Those numbers are always highly debatable. The best research that I know that roughly both sides have agreed is a fair approximation is fairly recent surveys in medical journals asking German men whether they've ever paid for prostitution, and 1 in 4 says yes. So not 1 in 4 is constantly doing this, but 1 in 4 has participated in it. And I guess kind of depends on who do you count as an active buyer. If he did it once when he was 18, does it count? So a smaller number, maybe something like 1 in 8 or 1 in 10 does it regularly, a couple of times a year. And then we know there are some high frequency buyers who might do it once a month or even once a week. If that sounds like a lot, that's because when prostitution is legalized, you actually see a drop in prices. It's quite cheap to do this, actually. There's really not much of a barrier for men to do it. It's culturally accepted and it's quite affordable. Something like $50-$60 can already get you access, and I'm talking vaginal penetration, for really peanuts. So 1 in 4 guys, that's a huge part of our society. We're not saying every single one of these guys is a psychopath, a sociopath looking to hurt a woman, but he's in a culture that says it's not your job to think about, why is she here? How is this for her? Is she okay? Does she actually like me? Is she kind of grossed out? These are things that a lot of men don't even spend much time thinking on, which the culture enables. I mean, if we were in a really healthy sexual culture, every time I touch someone intimately, I'm like, I pay attention. Or did they feel that they could say no to this? Would they have a reason to maybe say no to this? Are they comfortable? Is that smile genuine? In prostitution, you're paying for that smile. You're paying not to have to really think about how she feels. So we have the Russian roulette, right? She doesn't know who is going to choke her, rob her, kill her, right? And if this sounds exaggerated, we will provide some documents of safety advice given to women by organizations who prefer to call it a job and work. That really, it's all about how to not get robbed, raped, and murdered on the job. But the point is, sure, a lot of guys are not going to do this, but even those guys cause quite a bit of harm because, like Andrea said, she is there on constant alert. Would you want to have sex if you had to constantly, be in that room alone with men and you just don't know what he's going to do next? You don't know if this one's going to be dangerous? A woman in prostitution has to do 2 things at the same time that seem contradictory. She's on high alert in case he's an overt assaulter, and she's trying the vast majority of the time to dissociate from an unwanted sexual experience. Let's say that guy is not an overtly violent person, but she doesn't like how he tastes, smells, feels, and is trying to not be present in her body to have those at the very least unpleasant, possibly traumatizing sensations. Legalization doesn't change any of those things. The violent guys stick around. We got plenty of data to confirm that. We got really even homicides, plenty, unfortunately, over here in Germany. And even if that didn't exist, which it does, that part of it just being unwanted sexual contact does something to the body and the psyche. And again, as a culture, we struggle to talk about this. We like to say that women in prostitution have some kind of special constitution that they can handle this, that they just don't mind so much if the guy is, twice their age, twice their weight, etc. Over here, we believe women in prostitution are like everyone else, and of course it does, and it would to anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. And I think that, people forget that, I think once you are in prostitution and you've had your very first bad John, you automatically then will go into hyper awareness and hyper alertness, right? Of being safety conscious. So like you said, just knowing that there is that risk of danger. And I think if you admit it could be any guy, you will be in a really physically, mentally, emotionally dissociated state, right? Because you're trying to make sense of, okay, these people are dangerous, but I need to sell them this romantic lie, essentially. So not only are you having to be conscious of your safety to protect yourself, but you also have to not let the buyer know that you are aware that he is a risk, because that's really a buzzkill for him, thinking, oh, well, she's aware that I could choke her at any time. I mean, of course, there's buyers that's what they enjoy. They like that. But most guys want it to be as authentic as possible. And that's what they pay for, really, is the lie. I always say that men don't pay for the orgasm and the sex. They pay for the ego stroking and the lie. Because if you gave him the sex, but you said, I'm really scared of you, or I'm going to keep close to this panic button in the room here because you're kind of creepy and freaking me out. Obviously, the guy is either going to leave and get offended and you're not going to get the money that you need, or he's going to actually become violent because, again, he's offended, right? And he's like, oh, I'll show you, like, you're the object I've purchased. You should not be threatening me and my superior status to you. That inherent misogyny. So there's this really weird mixture where you have to perform all these things that are actually contrary to what you are experiencing and what you are feeling. And it kind of takes me back to like what my friend, my co-author of the book that I recently published, says at the John School when we speak to the men there. She said, you might not have been one of the bad guys. You might have paid, you might have protected or respected boundaries. You might have done everything so-called right. But what you did that was bad was you gave that woman a false sense of security. And so there is risk even in what the nice guys are doing by participating in this system, because I found the same thing for me. I would have a not so bad buyer, right? A polite buyer, one that tipped, one that brought me flowers, one that, asked about my day. Like, he didn't just treat me like an absolute object. He put on a show that he actually cared about me as a person. And what those men did, it was like, I won't call them a good client, but that's how we would say it. Like, good client, good client, good client. Boom. Now that guard has been lessened and you start to kind of not forget that the bad guys are out there, but it's just not in your day-to-day encounters. You're in that dissociated state and you're kind of looking beyond the little things that they're doing, because no buyer is ever totally great to you. They're all doing something to some degree that's greasy or creepy. But when they're not one of the absolute terrible ones, they do get you to that point that you're almost in this autopilot thing where that becomes your norm. And then your guard slips and boom, that's where one of these really dangerous guys. So they come in and that's getting back into that like Skittles analogy. And it might not all be crippling, terrible, bad stuff, but even whenever it has that dissociative impact, that alone, right, does a lot of emotional harm and mental harm. And for many of us, even myself included, now 11 years after exiting, I still deal with severe dissociation to the point that some days I can't even do anything almost except for self-care type stuff, some exercising or taking a bath or reading a non-related topic in a book, things like that. So yeah, it definitely, there's degrees of the violence that happens. And I think whenever we talk about approaches through policies, we always resort to the most extreme, right? How do we stop women from being killed? How do we stop women from being raped, choked? But we never talk about how we stop women from becoming traumatized and dissociated and depressed and self-loathing, self-hating, all those things that it's a slow death of the woman in these situations sometimes rather than that quick death that could come from murder or something along those lines. So there's a lot of nuance to the safety topic for sure. And I think people just never want to go into the unseen harms that are happening to women. We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
And so to kind of summarize, bring all of this together, tie the ends together, people think the reason that there's violence in the prostitution is because women cannot report it to the police in countries with prohibition where they themselves are criminalized. We will do an episode as to why women in legalized and so-called decriminalized regimes still end up being criminalized in a lot of ways. Not to go into the whole tangent, having some of the criminalization lifted, like we just said, does not remove the inherent harm of what unwanted sexual contact does to the body and mind. What it makes worse is the industry volume. The industry grows because you're raising a whole generation of boys and young men to participate in this and view this as normal, which again drives down the prices, increases the mentality in society that women can be potentially purchased. A whole lot springs from that. It ups the idea that customer is king. Because look, now even the government says, I'm just a customer, so deliver a good service or I will take my money back, potentially get into a fight with you, give you a bad review, or worse, assault you for it. And really what made me realize that legalization is really, these protections, vast majority exist on paper. They have so little impact on women's day-to-day life, was reading John forums, which we'll do a whole episode about. Don't know if it's already out or it will, but either check our old episodes or subscribe, follow the podcast to see that. There are online forums where men who pay for prostitution talk to each other. And I found in be it Germany or Switzerland or Austria or New Zealand or Australia, they are not afraid of committing outright assault. Where they know the woman said no, the woman said, please use the condom, the woman was crying, the woman was clearly dissociated, and they carry on regardless. They are not afraid of law enforcement. Maximally, they're a little bit afraid of pimps, which kind of neatly leads us into our next point, which is that people imagine that a legalized regime also keeps the men safer. Because if it's under prohibition, they imagine that's when all the organized crime is around. And we'll also do episodes as to why organized crime actually benefits in many ways from a legalized regime. That's another thing I found on the forums. The men say under legalized regimes that they have plenty of encounters with at least highly dubious characters. Sometimes they know the pimps on a first name basis. Sometimes they know the routes through Eastern Europe, where how the women are brought to Germany. Men are not afraid of cops or judges or whoever when they overtly assault women, but the only thing they fear is, having a run-in with like a coked up pimp who might beat them up, because fights do break out in legal brothels between shady bouncers and drunk men, and then sometimes someone gets a black eye, someone gets their skull cracked. That's when the Johns have to be afraid. And again, we said we don't have reliable statistics. I can't prove that to you with absolute certainty under what system the Johns are safer, but these types of things still happen. And what I can do and will do, certainly for Germany, I'll provide some statistics as to why the rates of assault on women are still extremely high, to the point that, like we mentioned, every day she goes into work, she's like, am I going to come home with a black eye? Am I going to come home completely dissociated, unable to enjoy my children hugging me? As always, 5 different ways to go with anything we touch on, for 5 different ways to go with the conversation.
Absolutely. No. And your point about this whole thing of are Johns safer? First of all, it's just exactly like you said, they are never at the degree of risk that the woman is, because they are not, first of all, the biologically vulnerable sex. It's very rare that a woman is going to be able to overpower them. So as you said, their fear usually rests in a man enforcing some type of rule upon them, or violating them in some type of way. It's very rarely that it's going to come from the woman, especially a vulnerable woman that's being abused in prostitution. And so really it comes down to men are not safer because of the system. They are safer because of just their biological reality. But what we do see with these licensed and decriminalized systems is that men are more enabled. That's where that is 100% true, right? Because of that cultural impact, again, saying buying sex is a right of yours as a man. There's no harm, no foul. Choice feminism has really encroached into that, distorting the whole conversation. There obviously is situations where sex buyers are victimized. They're robbed sometimes by women who are used as decoys by organized crime to put an ad out, and then the man will show up. And I know a man, actually, he was a buyer for 35 years, and he speaks at our John school, and he talks about going into this super seedy hotel to have a so-called date with a woman. And as soon as he arrives, she says, oh, I forgot something in the bathroom. And then he said, my spidey sense just went off. And I was like, no, I got to get out of here. And so he just ran. And he talks about getting into his car. And as he's peeling out of this motel, he looks in his rearview mirror, and there's 4 or 5 guys running out of the room after him. So again, it's not to say that, men aren't at risk in these encounters, because of course there's always dubious people that are around these women, whether they're drug dealers, pimps, so-called boyfriends that are looking to exploit and live off of them. But there really is a lot of lack of fear among them for any kind of accountability, just like you said, right? They don't care if a lot of them get arrested, because they are typically men who have money and have social status. And what we've seen here is that, a lot of men who get arrested, they can afford really good lawyers, and they will find a little loophole where it's, I was paying for her time and companionship. And then, if she decided on her own accord to have sex with me, well, that was just what naturally happened. I wasn't actually going there with the intent to buy sex from her. And so, whose word are they going to take, really, at the end of the day? A lot of women have a very hard time going to court, being put through that re-victimization, being, for lack of better terms, sorry to use this, slut shamed and stuff, being, oh, you deserve that. You were asking for that. Well, if you're so-called working in this sector, you have to expect that that's part of it. And I see that on Twitter with every friggin' post I make, and it boils my blood every time. Well, if she didn't want that to happen to her, she shouldn't be in that job. And I'm like, do we say that about men who are doing deep sea welding or oil rigging in dangerous places and stuff like that? Like, well, if he didn't want to lose an arm, he shouldn't have done that job. No, we look at these systems and oftentimes we say this is unacceptable work. And a lot of times, if an industry cannot be made safe, we work towards abolishing it. And we see that with a lot of like mining and stuff, right? Because there was no way in a lot of these places to secure the ground, where a lot of these mines were not collapsing on miners and stuff like that. So, we try to navigate away from that. We don't try to continue industries that keep people in harmful situations at these crazy disproportionate levels, simply because, hey, it's a job and it's work. There's some things that we do need, unfortunately, for the functioning of society, where we have to accept that somebody has to do that job, and we will try to mitigate all the risks as much and as best as we can. But prostitution is not a social need. And that's where I think people have a hard time getting their heads around that, because we have force-fed them this entitlement. And, hey, you want to get your rocks off? Well, click on Pornhub. Boom, you've got porn at your fingertips in seconds. You want to have sex with another person? Go on to, the internet. You can order up a woman like skip the dishes. Now it's just skip the consent. She'll be at your door instantly, kind of thing. Like, it's really grim how we're framing prostitution as a social need. Are Johns safer? Well, they've never been grossly at risk, but definitely they're more entitled when we go this route.
Yeah, so I also want to touch on, other jobs are dangerous too, potentially lethal, completely true. But we do need firefighters, and we do actually need builders. We need a roof over our heads, we need warm houses, especially over there in Canada. Yeah. But when it comes to the sex industry, we're literally talking about women dying fast or slow deaths. For what purpose? Male orgasms.
Exactly.
Which any man can take care of himself. Like, no one's coming to outlaw masturbation. It's the adding insult to injury to the highest degree. That the reason that all this harm is coming to women is for male sexual entertainment. And the other thing I want to talk about, which ties together the question of, are Johns safer and also is society safe with legalization, is the whole issue around condoms. One of the main arguments of the pro-decrim lobby is, if it's legal, we can supply women with condoms. There'll be condoms machines in every brothel. Actually, as far as I know, women have to pay for the condoms themselves. They're not actually like given to women by the state. None of that happens. But, the theory always sounds good. But at the end of the day, it's up to the guy. She can have all the condoms she wants in her room. I see it all the time, both in the stories of survivors and what the men themselves on the forums say. They fight women not to use the condoms. Like, I'll pay you a little bit more. Some will pull it off, a crime known as stealthing. It's just a form of rape, frankly. If a woman said use a condom and you don't do it or you pull it off, that's just rape. That's very frequent. And it's quite scary, because the sex buyers that scare me the most are the ones that like self-preservation, that are like, yeah, I know if I go on the street, the risk of the women who are really struggling with addiction and homelessness, that I, as the guy, will also get a potentially incurable or quite painful disease. But, my pleasure comes first. There's this subgroup of men that find that a particular sexual thrill, but it's not that small, the group of men who don't want to use condoms. I mean, again, outside of prostitution, we know men don't like condoms, even though it's one of the safest, if you use it correctly, ways of preventing STIs, most STIs, and pregnancy, and also doesn't have side effects on women's bodies. I think everyone should use condoms more, regardless of who you are and who you're sleeping with. If there's someone with a penis, please do. Please use condoms.
Please.
But the point being, the pro-decrim side argues that condom use will increase, but actually, for again taking my country, Germany, as an example, condom use was not mandatory in most of the country except Catholic Bavaria until 2017. So it was completely legal to do something like, I hate this word. It's almost too nice a thing for what happens, but we had condomless gangbang parties over here. And so, I mean, we'll do whole episodes on how that violates occupational health and safety. But the point is, people imagine with legalization, everyone is taking all these precautions, but that's not what the demand wants. The demand wants, a sexual experience to a specifications on the push of a button. And for many, many men, that includes no condoms. And they, not the women, as a lot of even the medical literature likes to talk about, it is those men who then go and infect their girlfriends and wives in one-night stands. We have this whole history of talking about women in prostitution as disease carriers, but it's actually those men doing it. The women are fighting for the condom use. And can you even imagine what it was like before condoms were around? But yeah, does it make society healthier? There's a very dodgy, very debunked study that claims that AIDS rates go down. That is not true. And we have an inherent problem with sexually highly irresponsible / dangerous men making the demand for prostitution.
Exactly. Every man wants to feel like he is not like the typical John. And I saw that myself too, is like, I did not offer kissing whenever I was in the industry, and I didn't offer bareback blowjobs, as we call them, oral sex without a condom. I was very fortunate in that regard. And that's sad to say that I was fortunate to be in prostitution at a certain time, but really that's the case. Like, we didn't see it until, I want to say, about 2008, 2010, somewhere in that 2-year time frame. That's when everything changed in Edmonton, where all of a sudden we had what's called the girlfriend experience. And, whenever I first started, if you kissed a sex buyer and it was found out by any other woman there, you would be driven out of that brothel. You would be sometimes assaulted by the women in the brothel, because they would say, why would that man stay with me when I won't do that service, but we offer the same pricing? Because we always tried to make our pricing comparable so that it wasn't, the guy paying twice as much for a woman who then is likely not to be chosen as much. Like, we wanted to try to spread out the creeps and get, money equally, because we realized we were all there to survive, right? So what we're seeing now in Edmonton, since this proliferation of GFE, girlfriend experience, is that now we've moved into porn star experience, PSE, because it's never enough for a buyer. He always needs to have more than the other buyer has, so that he can go back to the review boards and say, oh, I'm her favorite, I'm her number one, I got this. And it's like an ego posturing type thing that they do amongst one another. And I'm like, you're all paying for it, okay? Nobody is giving you this authentically. You are all paying for it. So you probably had to pay more for that, or you had to do a lot more pressuring or maybe force upon that woman to get that. So I don't know what you're here bragging about, but they do it. And now I have a friend who's still active in the industry here in Edmonton. And what she told me is that now bareback full service, as they call it, which is penis and vagina sex, is becoming the norm, because there is so much influx of trafficked women coming here who have no choice in condom usage, that they have kind of set that norm now within the industry, so that these so-called high-end women who are licensed and seemingly choosing prostitution operating out of brothels, they don't have that bargaining chip anymore, especially when they're in these higher prices than these trafficked women on these websites. And so they are having to offer bareback full service to these random strange men who are walking in off the street, or they're not making any money. And so how do they do that? They're taking antiviral medication, like anti-HIV meds. And so that's another cost out of pocket that, no brothel is offering these women that. No brothel is offering them condoms, any of this kind of stuff. So these women will say, well, I get the guy to come with papers showing that he's had an STI test done within the last week or two. But what does that mean? What does that even insure you? It doesn't mean anything. He could have left the STI clinic, went and had bareback sex with a woman in prostitution, and then gets his paperwork and comes sees you, right? So the women obviously know this, which is why they are then taking these antiviral meds just to ensure that they are safeguarding themselves. But, that's also very new medication that has not had thorough testing. And we also know that there's a lot of medical discrimination against women, especially things to do with our reproduction and sexuality within the healthcare field, that money is not invested in understanding this. So what long-term impact is this having on women who are maybe taking dozens of these pills every month to see dozens of strange men who we don't know what they're carrying, who are coming in and have that expectation and that entitlement, right? But it makes it more authentic, and it has to not ever feel like it's paid for by a guy. And it's alarming. Like, this has worked its way right up to the UN. Like, the UN AIDS has said by 2030, their goal is full decriminalization of prostitution worldwide. And the sole reasoning basically for that they argue is what you just said, condom usage, right? It'll help with condom usage. And it's this mythical underground argument. If we allow everything to be out in the open, there'll be no stigma, there'll be no judgment. It'll all be able to be regulated and enforced and this and that. But who is enforcing it? It's either, police, who are possibly sex purchasers themselves. I was purchased by police officers whenever I was in prostitution. Or it's somebody who's going to sit in the room and force a sex buyer to wear a condom and watch the whole act as it happens. Like, these things they're all utopian. They're all these concepts of like, this is how we're going to fix it. This is how to make it safe. But like you said, in reality, it just doesn't play out that way. And it's infuriating to see people argue these points that you just know are never, ever going to be accepted, because it kills the illusion of the desire of the woman, of that natural nymphotic woman who is there because she just loves sex. And then this then carries over into women in general society, right? Like, all of these things. So that kind of goes into our next part of like this concept that if we do all these things, this will then make the situation for the women in conventional society, that it will somehow improve their plight. And we know, again, that's not the case either. We see increasing rates of intimate partner violence. We see increasing rates of sexual harassment on the streets. Everything is increasing, and largely that's because of porn culture, but the ripple effect can't be understated.
German prostitution survivor Pushka Mao, and I'll link to her blog in the show notes. She has this quote which really encapsulates the problem. She says, "Women in prostitution are the crash test dummies of women." So a trend comes in porn. It's first tried out on the women in the porn videos, who are often also in prostitution. These industries overlap. It's then done to the women in the brothels. I mean, there's even screens with porn running in a lot of these places just constantly. Like, if anyone who says like there aren't plenty of men who like literally just want to play out what they just watched, they just need to step inside a brothel or talk to anyone who's experienced prostitution. Men come with specific requests of, can I do this? And then show some weird thing on their phone or whatever.
Totally.
And eventually, I mean, these sex acts, they come into the bedrooms of any woman. I mean, we know this. There's a rise in choking, which is really dangerous. There's actually no safe way to choke. Actually, experts say don't say choke, it's actually strangulation. There is no safe way to strangle somebody. There's always the risk of brain damage. Mm-hmm. That can even show up, with delay, so you don't see the harms immediately. And we'll have a strangulation expert on sometime to explain that, because really that should be common knowledge. It's not.
Sorry, Ellie, to correct you, it is not choking, it is breath play.
Oh.
Make sure you get your terms right.
Right, yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. We know that sexual violence was not invented with gonzo pornography. Of course not. But there is this underlying mentality that I thought women, leftists, any decent person was trying to fight, and that is just the idea that any woman owes a man sex, that sex is a service that women do for men, be it, the contract is marriage or the contract is I paid for the dinner. I've had a man once say to me, I paid for your bus ticket because I didn't have any cash that time. And he was like, now you have to sleep with me.
Wow.
I've experienced it over and over from prospective landlords suggesting that they reduce the rent or eliminate the rent for access to my body. That mentality of commodification is a very old problem that's been around for a long time, but legalized prostitution affirms it strongly. Mm-hmm. We will never get rid of this idea that men are entitled to sex if they've done women the slightest favor while this industry is around. It's 2024 and we're raising girls in a society where there's a lot of messaging that the sex industry is aspirational, a place to be sexually liberated. And actually, the women who are most at risk of this, though it can happen to any, are poor girls, girls of color, migrant girls. Again, if there's a lot of men running around thinking, she's got an Eastern European accent over here in Germany. Used to be with Russian women, now it's Romanian, Ukrainian refugees from war. That's a prospective prostitute. Let me see if I can offer her something. Let me just try with random women in my life, be it the woman working for me, the refugee who moved in next door, or the woman I'm renting a place to. Let me try to see who's purchasable. The other part that attaches to that is that, unsurprisingly, in major cities, you find that the mega brothels that you have over here in Germany, multi-story buildings, prostitution ed, where again, we're talking about these ridiculously low prices. Not that the high end is violence free, not at all, but again, just because of the sheer volume of men, it's particularly dangerous, these kinds of places. They are always, nearly always, in the poor part of town. Isn't that strange? Sometimes the slightly remote industrial area because people don't want it next door, but the communities who cannot push it out away from their schools, kindergartens, their homes, they have it next door. And people have this idea that these brothels absorb the violence somehow. Again, we've got these women with a special constitution who can somehow handle it. It doesn't bother them. It doesn't hurt them. So the sexually aggressive men go there and they come out and they are pacified. Yeah. Instead, anyone who lives in a neighborhood with street prostitution or brothel prostitution knows that drunk, entitled, harassing, misogynistic men spill out of there. And obviously they go back home to their wives or girlfriends, half of them are partnered. And, that drives down the housing prices, and then anyone who can afford moves away. It harms the whole community. And we see that any place, be that Germany or New Zealand. New Zealand is always held up as somehow a success story. People are slowly starting to admit that there are problems in Germany, but New Zealand is still held up as a success story. But I will link a report that I was involved in with writing by the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. The New Zealand communities too, they have this huge issue of poor, and in New Zealand it'll be often, indigenous communities having to have this industry outside of their doorstep and fighting the city councils and being like, we cannot have this here. We cannot, we're having to teach their kids to recognize a used condom or a needle and not touch that and not play with it because it's littered everywhere. And again, as a society, we like to be like, oh, can the women just go to the industrial area and, stop bothering the community? No, it's the men who are like, I want to have the convenience of, after work, I drive through the poor part of town. I purchase myself a woman for 20 minutes, pay her a pittance, then go back home to my wife. They are the ones making that place unsafe. They are the ones harassing the schoolgirls, etc. But again, in our debates, we're just talking about the women. And I mean, when you've seen these examples of prostitution, especially deregulated, especially permissible, you just see how harmful it is to the community on all these different levels.
Absolutely. Yes. And, whenever you're talking about this, it made me think about Edmonton. And, for anybody who is familiar with my backstory, when I was 3 years into prostitution, I was really deluded under this safety myth. Like, I had completely bought into sex work ideology. I believed, that there was bad things happening, but that it was the location of the brothel that I was operating out of. It was the type of men that would go to that neighborhood of the brothel that I was in. And, if I could just build a really high-end, luxury, fancy brothel in a clean, safe, good part of town, none of these things would happen. And so unfortunately, that's what I did at age 25 is I maxed out every credit card I had, and I begged my parents actually for a loan. I had come out to them about what I was doing, and I was paying my way through university. And, I didn't tell them any of the harm that was happening to me. And my parents obviously didn't really understand what the true nature of everything was, but I begged them for money saying, I'm operating out of these different places and I'm working for people who are really insistent that I stay with every person that comes into the facility. They're fining me hundreds of dollars if I'm 5 minutes late for my so-called shift. There's all these problems. So I really thought at 25 that I could make it safe for women. And I believed all these things. And so the brothel that I built, it was just a boutique brothel. It was a 2-room place because I just basically wanted to not, be under someone else's control. So I I looked to kind of do like a 1-room facility type thing, but I also understood that it was dangerous for me to be there completely by myself. And I knew a lot of women who were very unhappy operating at our city licensed brothels in Edmonton. And they said, if you build a place for yourself, like, can I rent a room part-time from you so that I'm not, here in this situation? And I feel like you would understand because you're a seller yourself. And I said, yeah, absolutely. So that's actually how it led to me creating this 2-room brothel. It's so unfortunate because, the area I chose, I obviously didn't still have a lot of money because people think women in prostitution get rich. But even though you have often high volume of money coming your way, you are self-soothing with that money. And I also had a husband at the time that I don't talk about often, but I was with him for 4.5 years out of the 7 that I was in prostitution. And he was a leech. He lived off me completely. He never held down a job. If he did get a job, it would last for about 2 weeks, and he'd spend all the money on alcohol and buying hotel rooms to take other women to have sex with them. And I bought a vehicle for him. I paid for all of his clothes, his groceries, like everything, right? It was, I won't say he was a pimp or an exploiter. He was just a deadbeat and a young guy who liked the partying lifestyle. So, I had a lot of costs. So I didn't leave prostitution rich, and I was never, sitting on mounds of money whenever I was in prostitution. Just as quickly as it came, it went. But I took all, my available credit and everything and prostituted myself at like a very high rate, sometimes seeing 13 men in a 14-hour shift at a brothel, a double day, just to bank enough money to be able to build this brothel so that I could leave with this hope of it being this, beautiful thing that I had seen in Pretty Woman. And the brothel that I chose, the location, it was just a raw commercial space, but it was a 3-tier commercial building that was on an avenue in Edmonton. And it had on that avenue, I think, 4 schools and 7 churches. And that was in something like a 10-block radius, like not even. Like it was right smack in the middle of that. And now I look back with so much shame to that decision. And I understand I made it with constrained knowledge and constrained agency to some degree, but I look back at like, what impact did I make on my community by doing that? I remember being, in the brothel because I sold myself out of that brothel more than anybody. So I was there constantly, sun up to sundown. And I can't tell you how many times teenage boys from the high school that was within walking distance would walk by the brothel and would open up the door and push a young girl in there and be like, get to work, ha ha, whore, slut, calling her whatever name. And she'd be terrified. Or they'd push other boys in there and be like, get in there, ha ha ha. So like when people say, well, okay, but at least if it's indoors, it's not spilling over into community. All those kids knew what that so-called business was. And I had blacked out windows. I didn't have anything that would have really tipped them off to it. But they would see women coming and going, or women, being dressed in lingerie and then just throwing a robe over themselves, but still wearing their stiletto heels and stepping outside to smoke a cigarette, or, or sitting in their cars, like their Mercedes-Benz cars that, they had rented or leased. And all of that, it just, you can't ignore the impact that does have on community. Like people know what is happening in their communities, especially in areas like that where you've got teens walking, right? Because so many of them take public transport. And so they'd get off at their bus stop and they'd walk down the avenue and they'd go right past that and they'd see these things and they'd see the men pulling up and, going in there and all that. So like that was very sad. And I often think like, how traumatic was that for the boys and girls that were being pushed into that facility? But, also like, how did that impact their, not only just that moment of being traumatized, of being in this environment and like, oh my gosh, but also just how that made them feel, right? As a young girl, like, oh, so this is a place where I could be sold or bought by men whenever I'm 18. And, here's my peers, my male peers pushing me in there, telling me that's basically my future and what I'm destined for. So, I always say like I left a stain on my city. And if I won the lottery tomorrow, the very first thing I would do is buy that quote unquote business from the woman who owns it now. And I would shut it down and I would make that location a drop-in center for women in prostitution who needed any kind of resources, information, support, food cards, whatever it may be, just to give back to that community what I took from that community. Yeah, so we never leave the industry guilt-free, I guess you could say. Like there's always, I think any woman who leaves prostitution and wakes up to the reality of it realizes the impact that they have had on other women. And, for you, the listener, if you haven't read a paper I've wrote, there's a paper I wrote all about this called A Mule for the Patriarchy. And it talks about my slow awakening to the impact that I had in my spouting off of choice feminism and sex work is work, the impact that I had on wives and girlfriends of the sex buyers that were coming in. So there's so much and so many layers to that. We just can't ignore these things. If we're talking about what's actually safe for people, we have to also look at a community lens and not just this micro individualized type lens.
Do I understand correctly? When you were at the brothel being run by other people, they forced you or pushed you or pressured you to not turn down any guy?
Yeah, that was pretty common. I don't know if it's necessarily the money aspect as much as it was actually the mental aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Because whenever you're trying to tell yourself it's a job like any other, then you're like, well, this is a customer, like you never get customers that you like in every job. So just take any of them. Like they're all just customers. And I remember one guy coming in, he was so terrible. I had stayed with him a couple times and I said, I can't stay with this guy anymore. And I had mentioned it as soon as I saw him on the camera, right? Because we had a camera in the hallway to the building. And so we'd get about a minute of them walking down the hallway where we'd see them in advance. So I said to the women, I'm not staying with this guy. Like, he's terrible. Nobody stayed with him. All the women rejected him. And then I remember after that, the owner giving a big lecture, basically to me, but to everybody, saying, don't say that kind of stuff, because a guy that might have been horrible and terrible to you might be the best client to another girl. So as a business, we need room rental fees because they can't take any money from you otherwise, right? Because then they're like materially benefiting from prostitution. So all that any brothel gets in Edmonton, aside from these fees that they levy in order to make more money, is the room rental fee, which is about between $40 and $60 per hour per John. So it was this big long lecture about like, hey, if you got a problem with a buyer, don't talk about it. And I'm just like, are we actually here to safeguard women? And that, like, all those little things, even though they were horrible, they actually did serve to help me in that awakening, because I was like, what do you mean? Like, we should definitely be communicating with one another. And that's one of the arguments that they put forth. The sex work lobby is saying, well, women can't communicate, women can't, share information when all these things are the case, right? When there's any criminalized context. But it's like, even when you do that in what we had at the time and still do, de facto decrim, it's still shunned and shamed because, hey, it's a job like any other. And if you talk about the harm, then you're, making it uncomfortable for other women who need to stay in that dissociated state in order to perform and make not only their earnings, but the earnings of the brothel as well.
My point that I wanted to get to, I don't have a lot of respect for German law because I think it totally inadequately protects women and girls. Our age of consent is 14. I don't have much respect for it. But it does actually say if you are pressured or forced to not turn down men, that is a serious indication of human trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
That means that you could have, in Germany, theoretically, we know in practice, unlikely, but you could have qualified as a trafficking victim in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know you often say, like, you weren't trafficked, but even according to really totally inadequate German law, there you could have had a case.
Yeah, and people have said that to me actually quite a few times over many things that I've mentioned about my experience in prostitution, and even just little things like, the advertisements that we would come across, that would say like, hey, make $2,000 a week. Like, that's a form of coercion to entice someone to enter prostitution, and human trafficking is exploitation via fraud, force, or coercion. So when you're looking at even just the advertising of these brothels or agencies that are, doing escorting and stuff like that, a lot of them really are falling into that trafficking realm. So I battle with that because, like, I look at, for me personally, the difference between myself and a woman who is taken from one side of Canada to Edmonton, forced to give up her money to a man or woman trafficking her. To me, I don't see my experience in that same context, but that's the problem too, is that we compartmentalize a lot of these things and we say, well, this is not exploitation, but this is. But when you're zooming out on it and you're looking at it, it does have that overarching trafficking vibe to it. Absolutely. Right. And that's the contradiction between the labor approach and the human rights violation approach that we accept, right? Is they can't work together. Like, you can't have human rights in a system that inevitably operates in fraud, force, or coercion for the vast, vast majority of those involved.
When we say 80 to 90% of women are exploited, we're not saying every one of them is in a basement chained to a radiator. Almost nobody is. But we are talking about women are constantly under serious pressure. There'll be serious consequences if they say no to a specific sex, like a specific guy, a specific shift. However it is that type of coercion is created, that is a sexual encounter. It's not the right wording. I notice people get very upset if I call it rape. That is unwanted. That is somewhere on the spectrum of violence. And if there is a concrete person, pushing and pushing, how is that not a pimp? But I think we will have to have whole episodes on the spectrum of coercion and how that works. On my YouTube channel, I have this video of a woman who was interviewed in a documentary that's supposed to be very cheerful about this brothel that later turned out to be a place of systematic human trafficking. And she says, I like this place because they don't make me accept every single John.
Yeah, make me. Exactly. That says it all right there, right? And when you say that, people think like gun to the head, like he didn't make me do it, the brothel owner, but there's the invisible chains. And that's what people fail to realize is it's just like you said, nobody is physically chaining these women to the beds. Like, yes, there is some of that, unfortunately, where women are chained to a bed and drugged, and men will just come as like an assembly line and use them and leave. But that is so rare because, again, buyers don't want to feel like violators. They want to feel like they are good men who are entitled to have relaxing, therapeutic time with a beautiful woman and be de-stressed. And, it's all how it's sold to them too. And I think that's why they get so mad at people like you and I when we start challenging that and saying, like I have no problem saying prostitution is paid rape. But holy shit, whenever I say it, I prepare for about 5 days at least on Twitter of getting attacked and people being like, this really undermines when women are actually raped, especially those that are raped in prostitution. And I'm like, but none of it is happening. None of the exchange is happening outside of a context of coercion. And as soon as you have coercive sex, that is a sexual violation. And so here in Canada, we don't even have a law on rape. It is sexual assault. So really rape means an egregious violation. Like it's still a word that you can use to say that, to talk about the context of the encounter. But because it's a law in America, an actual rape, they see that as like sensationalized rape, again, of what's happening in media. Like the guy is, lurking around on the alley and sees her come out of the bar late at night and creeps along and then attacks her and pulls her into the van without windows and, sexually assaults her and then pushes her out and drives away. Like they can't understand that the vast majority of rape, sexual assault, whatever term we give it in a legislative, judicial type way, is actually constituting the same thing. Like it's coercive sex, which is sex without consent. So I really have become a lot more unapologetic about it. I'm like, I don't care. I'm going to start saying it. I'm going to keep saying it. And if people have a problem with it, so be it. It's the truth.
Before we move on, just one more quick myth around legalization, and that is that actually the sex buyers help keep women safer because when they themselves are not criminalized, whenever they see coercion, they will just report that to the police or social workers or whomever, and then those people can intervene. And that way, the system is kept, trafficking is, not zero, but decreased. But that's not at all what we observe. We have several studies from countries' legalization where men very clearly say they do not feel responsible. Hotlines that have been created specifically for the purpose of men reporting this have very low calls. And, when you talk to a trafficking victim or criminal investigator, they tell you there have been hundreds or thousands of men who raped this trafficked adult or minor, and no one said anything. And again, this actually even happens inside legal brothels. It takes the police, on average, like half a dozen years, a decade, to really bring down these systematic big trafficking rings. And Johns and their reporting proves very unhelpful. So not to say that no man ever calls the cops. But one, even when he's criminalized, you can make an anonymous tip to the police. Mm-hmm. You can. No one's stopping you. But even when it's legal and they have nothing to fear, the evidence is just not there that they care. It's, again, customer is king. And I always say, it's especially appalling because it's true that there's trafficking into other industries. For example, nail salons have quite a high rate of trafficking of Asian women, which, if you ask me, we can also think, do we really need nail salons? Do we need to, all the chemicals that women breathe all day? We can have a whole debate about if maybe that's also an industry that we want to reconsider, if we can get those women, trained to do other work. Point is, when you are a woman who walks into a nail salon getting your nails done, maybe the woman there doesn't speak English or German or whatever, but okay, she could just be, a working migrant. That's totally possible. She could be a trafficking victim. It is legitimately hard for you to tell unless she's visibly distressed. But when it comes to prostitution, and you're a guy at often a legal brothel, you're walking in, you're going to be alone in the room with the woman, again, naked and inside her, the most intimate you can get, and you're still not totally sure if she wants to be there. Don't touch her in the first place. If you're not sure, don't touch her in the first place.
Yep.
Like these men saying, I can't be sure, even the trafficked women, they smile at you, which is totally true. Yeah, then maybe something's rotten with the whole system.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And you'll hear that all the time from sex buyers, right? I only see consensual sex workers. I don't purchase sex from trafficking women. And I have never, in 11 years of confronting men on that point that they make, ever heard a method that is foolproof that they employ that ensures that. And they know it's false too and fake, but that's the lie that they tell themselves on their end, right? Like the women will tell themselves certain lies to not feel exploited, and the men will tell themselves certain lies to not feel like an exploiter. And so this myth, and you've done a great video on that, and I hope you put that in the show notes too for everyone. Ellie has this fantastic video on YouTube called The Myth of the Happy Hooker, I think is what the title of it is. Is that what it's called? The Myth of the high-end...
The high class... Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I don't know. You did it a long time ago, so we'll put it in the show notes. But wow, like that, I use that all the time to send to people because I'm like, no, false, because there is no way to tell. Because again, it's going back to that whole thing of the illusion. Like, what woman is going to say, yes, I am trafficked? How many of those women even know what trafficking is, or just think like, I have a boyfriend and we're working towards a goal together, or I have a debt that I'm trying to repay. Like a lot of times they are not even privy to the fact that they are being trafficked. And if they are, then they're just in survival mode and they need that money. And they're probably more scared of their trafficker getting mad at them for not having money than they are about a man getting mad, right? So like they have to kind of weigh who they're really concerned about for those fears. But once we have licensing, that creates this illusion of consent. And we hear that all the time too in Edmonton, right? Like, well, if you just go to the licensed brothels, then you're going to be with a sex worker. Whereas if you drive on low track or high track, like the drag here on the street, then you're definitely getting someone who doesn't choose that. So it's like, how do we all of a sudden think that because we have a brick and mortar building and we have licensing that all of a sudden that equates to consent? And I made a tweet about this probably now a couple of years ago. And I said, none of the men that came into the brothel actually asked me for my consent. To them, it was implied because I was in a brothel. But still, like, how did they conclude that, right? Like, how did they come to that point without actually checking with me, right? Because again, I could have been trafficked and placed in that brothel. And what does that mean, right? We see that overpour all the time because if you're trafficking a woman and you have her really well mentally duped or conditioned, she, like we said, will not really probably understand that she's trafficked. So she's not at risk of telling people in the brothel, hey, I'm a trafficking victim. So all that is happening is that she is having that illusion of being not trafficked, which is being upheld by the state. I spent 7 years speaking to women who were entering into Edmonton's licensed brothel system at this information course that the city mandates that all people entering the industry have to take. Which, okay, if we're going to be licensing, I support that there's information and stuff being given to these women. But it was all a smoke and mirror show, right? Like it was really a way of kind of deceiving them almost into believing that they had choice and agency and saying, oh, you're applying for a business license. You are a service provider. Like it's all that labor language. And I saw women that were brought there from 21-hour flights that they had just gotten off of coming from China. And it would be one man. It was always usually the same guy, sometimes a different guy. And they would bring 3-4 Asian women who could not speak a word of English to come sit in the course that at that time did no translation. The women were nodding off, falling asleep. Many of them would be going into the bathroom during the break and injecting drugs and coming back and nodding off, drooling down themselves. These men are waiting in the lobby for these women to finish the course, to get their certificate, to then go up to the next floor of the building to get their actual license. We eventually, an organization here that was doing a presentation, CEASE, Center to End All Sexual Exploitation, we said, we're going to bring in a translator to talk to these women because the city wasn't doing anything because that's a cost and they don't like to invest in any of this. So we brought in a translator who spoke 4 Asian languages plus English. And I said to this woman, can you go ask this woman who was sleeping throughout the whole course, like, why she's sleeping? Like, does she need help? Did she get any of this information? Can she understand English when it's vocal? Like, does she need written printouts? Like, how can we help her? And that's where, this woman, our translator, was finding out all this info. And so, I'd even go to the city and say, this creepy man is bringing these women here and all this is happening. And I eventually found out through other women in the industry that this man was a sex buyer and that the brothel owner of these Asian themed parlors, many of which are involving trafficked women here in Canada on gambling debts, this brothel owner basically traded the women for sex to this man for him to be the one to drive them and bring them to the course and ensure that after the course, when they got their license, they would go back to the apartment building that they all had to live in together and stuff. So again, it's sold as, oh, well, we're offering free housing, free accommodation for the workers. And it's like, no, you're putting them in an apartment and probably taking their documentation and holding them there because they are debt bonded through gambling debts, and stuff like that. So like there was all these cracks in the system again where nobody cared. It was just like, well, that's just a worker. It's a guy who works for the owner of the brothel. He's helping her. Everything was reduced to job roles and never about sexual predation or opportunism. Very sick, all of it. I had to eventually just leave. I said, I can't ethically participate in this anymore. And I left. So
that's horrific, but totally unsurprising to me. Completely mirrors Germany and the Netherlands, both who have instituted only some years ago that women need to carry around a piece of plastic, a prostitute's license, and they need to be interviewed for that. What's that 1 or 2 hours with the social worker going to do? And social workers tell us, or when you're in the Netherlands registering at the Chamber of Commerce, because you will be taxed. We have a lot of trafficked women being taxed, a lot of distressed women being taxed. Isn't that wonderful? Without actually accessing a lot of the benefits of taxation. But anyway, to not go on another tangent, the employees of the Chamber of Commerce or the social workers are saying there are these men waiting outside. Sometimes they even are quite brazen. They come in with the women. Nothing we can do. If she says it's the boyfriend, even if all our spidey senses are saying something's off, what can we do? In a legalized system, unless the individual woman screams for help, screams I'm a trafficking victim, which for a million reasons she very likely won't, there's nothing you can do about it. She'll get the license, and then everyone will feel, the buyers and the brothel owners are in the clear, and most likely she's never going to get any help, realistically. And I personally know women who went through this licensing process. It didn't detect them at all. And, their attitude to the German state after going through that, having your government sanction that overt paid rape. It's just, if you can't even acknowledge that sex trafficking is paid rape, I don't know what kind of consensus we can have in this debate. But yeah, that's the reality of legalization all over, wherever.
Well, then it loops back to harm reduction, right? Whenever I would say to people at the city, like, this is clearly an issue of exploitation and trafficking. Like, this guy has now brought like 20 women in the last 2 months. And they're like, well, but at least now we know their names and we know where they're operating out of. So at least they're not in the underground. Now we can go help them. And I'm like, okay, but again, how are you going to help them? You just gave them the license. Like, now, okay, if you can access the brothel, which many times we had a hard time getting into those Asian themed brothels.
Same here. If I have a business, I can close it I could decide who comes in, right? I can just say social workers, whatever cops need a warrant, you're staying out of here. Gift to traffickers, 100%.
Yeah. And so they would say, as we approach and we'd be like, we just want to give you some condoms. We have a health nurse with us. Like, can we just have a couple of minutes to chat with you? And more often than not, women would say to us, no, he said no. He said no. So like, again, they have very limited English. So we're not really sure, what we're hearing from them, if it's what they intend to say. But, we've heard reports of men sitting in the back with like machetes within reach and things like that, So I think Simon Hagstrom, Swedish police officer, he said it so eloquently. And I say this honestly all the time. So I'm sorry if this is like the 100th time someone has heard me say this, but he says, if a sex buyer can find a woman in prostitution, so can the police. We believe that we need licensing for harm reduction, but really what it is it's a reactive system that only tells us who these women are after. It's a paternal system that says, women, you are responsible for being licensed. You are responsible for reporting to the city all these things that you have to give us so that we know who you are. And it's ineffective because at the end of the day, what is that piece of paper doing, or that plastic card, to actually keep you safe in the room? And the answer is nothing. Oh, but then we can report these bad guys. Okay, sure. But the city doesn't make them take a course, doesn't make a sex buyer get a license. They don't have to have a card. They don't have to do any kind of background checks and police record checks like we had to do every year. So even if you can report that something bad has happened to you, you oftentimes don't even know who that man actually is. And so maybe that's, I don't know if there's anything more that you want to say on this higher idea and concept of safety, but maybe that kind of leads us into this next part about the concrete measures and, talking about these things like, well, okay, but now we have an image of the guy on the camera and all these other things that we think will help us retroactively get justice for these women when we know it's not the case.
And this is where the episode got a little bit too long, so we will split this up and do a part 2 that will be out shortly. And this is where we go into the nitty-gritty and really tease out what are these concrete proposals that have been made, methods that have been tried to make women safer in prostitution, and to what degree might we want to support them even when the ultimate goal is a shrinking and ultimately abolishment of the industry. What harm reduction might still make sense, and what is just inadequate, again, giving false hope, or even backfiring and really benefiting someone like a brothel owner far more than the women whom it is supposedly there for. If you're interested, make sure to follow the podcast, stick around. There is a lot more to say. We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.